And we're back for more history. Last week, we told you about quarantine and how, even though it's one of the oldest practices in the medical field, it is still one of the most effective ways to combat illness. This week, we're going to talk about masking up. I know, it's not what everyone wants to hear about, but bear with me, it's not what you think, I promise. In fact, we might actually be talking about the most famous masks in history. We're talking about plague masks. The plague was one of the most feared diseases in the world, capable of wiping out hundreds of millions of people in seemingly unstoppable global pandemics and afflicting its victims with painful swollen lymph nodes, blackened skin, and other gruesome symptoms. In 17th century Europe, the physicians who tended to plague victims wore a costume that has since taken on a more sinister overtone. They covered themselves head to toe and wore a mask with a long bird-like beak. During that period's outbreak of the bubonic plague, towns gripped by the disease hired plague doctors who practiced what passed for medicine on rich and poor residents alike. The costume is commonly credited to Charles Delorme, a physician who catered to the medical needs of many European royals during the 17th century. He described an outfit that included a coat covered in scented wax, breeches that connected to boots, a tucked-in shirt, and a hat and gloves made of goat leather. Plague doctors also carried a rod that allowed them to poke or fend off victims. Their headgear was particularly unusual. Plague doctors wore spectacles as eye protection, and a mask with a nose described as half a foot long, shaped like a beak, filled with perfume with only 2 holes, one on each side near the nostrils, but they can suffice to breathe and carry along with the air one breathes. Confusing? I think so. These weirdly bird-shaped masks did in fact have a purpose outside of scaring the general public, though. Physicians would wear these as part of their medical uniforms while tending to the sick under the supposition it would have protected them from disease. Now we know these masks of nightmares weren't merely fashion statements. The theory was that they would isolate the physicians and prevent direct contact with the bodies of plague victims. Which I guess it technically did. The shape of the mask was thought to give air sufficient time to be suffused by herbs before it was inhaled by plague doctors. They would fill the bill with a compound of more than 55 herbs and other components like viper flesh powder, cinnamon, myrrh, and honey. Plague doctors believed that illness was spread through poison air, what they called miasma, which wasn't wrong per se, but they thought by stuffing the bill of the mask with things that smelled pretty, they would be protected. Now let's talk about why the costumes worn by plague doctors actually worked. While the costumes plague doctors wore didn't actually protect the wearer in the way they thought it did actually give a little protection when it came to inhalation of infectious droplets from sneezing or coughing people, though not nearly enough. Plague doctors may have been immediately recognizable, but until the rise of germ theory of disease and modern antibiotics, their costumes didn't provide enough protection against the disease. Plague is caused by a bacterium that affects humans and other mammals. It is spread through being bitten by an infected flea, by respiratory droplets into the air by an infected animal, or by handling an animal infected with plague. Plague doctors' costumes provided a reasonably effective barrier from flea bites, and the mask reduced the number of airborne droplets the doctor was exposed to. It was one of the world's first versions of PPE. The Black Death killed nearly 1/3 of Europe's population in its height. Luckily today, modern antibiotics are effective in treating plague. Without prompt treatment, the disease can cause serious illness or death. So even though today, plague doctor is a Halloween costume, human plague infections continue to occur in Africa and Asia, and even in rural areas of the western United States.